So at 8 o'clock, I thank Jesus for the gospel, particularly that last bit. Because, you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't, Give a good sermon and you're a false prophet. Reminds me of the story of the poor priest that had a nervous breakdown because every Sunday he tried to preach a prophetic sermon, and every Sunday everybody said, "Lovely sermon, Vicar, lovely sermon." Just cracked him up, so in a not a good sense. I don't know if you realize it, but Luke's gospel, I think you do know this. Luke's gospel is basically one of two books. The second book is the Acts of the Apostles. At the beginning of Luke, he talks about setting in order all the things in the life of Jesus and the things Jesus did in the beginning of the gospel. And then in the Acts of the Apostles, Luke says, that he's going to tell the things Jesus continued to do. But this time doing not directly, but doing through his people who had received his Spirit and were the apostles and the disciples. And somewhere hidden away in chapter 17, as Paul and Silas on their missionary journey end up in a place called Thessalonica, there's a sort of they go to the synagogue and they proclaim Jesus as Messiah, and some people believe, but most didn't. And then, but there was a number of people who Luke calls Greeks or Gentiles that did believe, and they all ended up at this going into a person's house, this guy called Jason, and there they sort of gathered in Jason's house and they listened to Paul a bit more, and maybe they learnt prayers and so on and so forth. Well, people got upset. The leaders of particularly the synagogue, got upset and went to the city council and tried to get the city council to turn against this blasphemous sect. And hidden away there in the middle of that Acts of Apostles chapter 7 is this statement: those who have turned the world upside down, those who have turned the world upside down have come here also. Have come here also. Inside, outside, upside down. That's going to be a phrase. You'll get used to it. The vestry have embraced it as a vehicle for sort of mapping out the priorities of their work over the next year and maybe beyond that. But there's an element of things we need to do inside in our worship, in our pastoral care, in our fellowship, in our social life, in the formation, education of our children, of our youth, of ourselves. That there's going to be aspects of our work which are going to be outside, that are going to be about our contact with the world outside, our response to those in need around us. The wonderful work of Go, the work that we do in Uganda. I was reminded of that kind of work just yesterday. I was there from midnight to 4:30. I was participating in a funeral of a dear bishop friend who had shared with us ministry as bishops and dioceses from his place in southern Africa, in Eswatini, used to be Swaziland, and Iowa, together with the Diocese of Brecon in Scotland. We over 20 years, and much more earlier than that, we've worked together. We worked with their orphans, and they've worked with us outside the walls. And then there's upside down. Originally, that group was called marketing. Marketing. And you think, well, what's upside down about marketing? Well, the first question of a marketer is, what's your product? What's your brand? What is it you're actually, we've got to sell this gig, someone said at the annual meeting. What gig is it? What is our gig? Our gig is to turn the world upside down. A gig is to turn the world upside down, to turn its values on its head. The cute way of describing our active categories as vestryman leaders for the future. But to mark it that what we have in our experience of God, in what we desire to sort of express in terms of God's love for the world, the values that we have, the habits of Jesus, teaching his way of life and living his way of life. We have to be selling something that is turning our lives upside down. And will turn the world upside down. Some of us in our morning groups, our Monday morning group, there's a women's group that meets in person, there's a men's group that meets on Zoom. And that group we've been studying, we're studying the same book together, the first Christmas, the same book. And it's a study of Luke and a study of Matthew and the Christmas narratives. I think I referred to it before. And Matthew is clearly talking about to one community. Luke is talking in many ways to a broader community. It's very clear from what we've been reading that when you see all the symbolism that is placed at the time in the story of Jesus' birth, so much of that symbolism actually has a kind of counterpart. And the counterpart is with the society of the time, particularly the Roman Empire. The Christians believe that just as that Jesus was this Prince of Peace, that he brought peace with justice, he brought peace by gentleness, he brought peace with mercy. And the Romans also wanted peace. But they might say to themselves, we're more realistic about life. We're more realistic about human beings. We have actually realized that to have peace, you have to control violence. And there's only one way to control violence, and that's with more violence. Keep the strong man down. Keep the rebels down. And then in the midst of that peace that you create by the force of your strength, you can build your villas and they won't be pillaged. You can make roads and they can get you from A to B quicker and not stuck in mud with whatever at the mercy of every weather change. You can build spas and you can have baths. You can entertain. You can live the life of peace. But to do it, you have to keep the strong man in place. You have to keep the chaos in place. So they also wanted peace. And that peace initially had some sort of democratic elements to it. You elected your officials and so on and so forth. You had a Senate. But in the end, one strong man was sufficient. Let's get an Augustus Caesar. And then maybe his family. All the people that just one, and then everything else can fit from there. And so those emperors that they had to have strong armies to keep themselves in place. And in one book that I'm reading about what they call Pax Romana, it's called Pax. The story is of kind of basically 1 year of 68, 69, just after Nero had died. And there were like 4 people fighting to become emperor. One lot had a lot of armies and legions that were in Germany. Another had armies and legions that were in the east. Some had a bit closer to Italy. And gradually they had to fight each other off to get to one of them to get to the point of emperor. In the meantime, as one of them was coming from the east, they got poked in the eye by the Jews, and they just turned around and flattened all of Israel and all of Judea. Made Jerusalem into a sort of Gaza of today. Quite ironic. And then went on their way to their real task, which was to become emperor and establish peace. And I thought about this. I thought about how the Jews kind of got in the way halfway through that sort of story and probably didn't expect to see coming what was coming. And they were just kind of like collateral damage to the great cause of Rome. And of course, Rome went on and had other occasions of similar fights, and people were very aware all the time. They had to be alert to the prospect of enemies that could usurp. And maybe they got 10 years of peace. Maybe they got a little bit here, a little bit there. So I think to myself, so what about the church? How did early Christians get on? What were they doing in the midst of all this stuff? How on earth did they manage to grow? Clearly they were aware that Jesus was a sort of an alternative. They didn't create political parties, or they didn't create their own armies. They didn't do any of that. But they continued to grow. They were persecuted. Every now and then they did get the notice of the authorities, and they were then used as sport in the Colosseum and places like that. They knew that their life was always right. They lived in secret many times. They had catacombs. They had secret signs of where they were meeting to do their prayers, meeting to break bread, and to acknowledge the presence of Jesus in the breaking of that bread. Meeting to make sure their widows and their orphans had enough to eat. Meeting to make sure nobody who was hungry could not be filled. Nobody who was without home could not have somewhere to shelter. Nobody who was weeping because of the loss of loved one was not be comforted by the presence and the love of others. And the rich were among them, and the filled were among them. And those who had good lives in this world were among them. Those of good repute were among them. But because of their interaction with each other, the rich became poor, that the poor might become rich. The full became hungry, that the hungry could be filled. Those that were having laughter were able to weep with those that were weeping, that all could laugh together. How did they do it? How did they do it? But they did it for almost 300 years. They grew. Tertullian would say that the blood of the martyrs, the ones who gave their lives during this time, were in fact the very seed of the church's growth. Jesus was right. Blessedness was along that path and not along the path of woes. But even woes could be transformed into blessedness because of the topsy-turvy, upside-downness of the Christian message and the Christian values. If God could become human and a slave and a servant, giving God's self to death for our sake, so could they. And that was their pattern. That's why they came together. That's how they succeeded. To become a movement in the midst of this other way of being that the Roman Empire represented. And as I've said before, we are their ancestors. They are our ancestors. We are their descendants because of the gift of the Spirit, who has never stopped moving, always seeking to create a community that turns things upside down. Now, it could be said, and I would probably admit this, that when Constantine, one of the emperors, decided that, the real winning sign here is not the way I'm doing it, it's this cross. And then he brought the cross into it. We kind of were turned up. So since then, the church was turned back to its right side. And we started using power ourselves to the effort of promoting the gospel. But there were still the Francises. There were still the nuns and the monks. There were still the Columbus. There were still all of those wonderful people that we admire that would keep the upside downness going. And we are in their company this morning, and we are their company this morning. We're invited by the very power of the resurrection so wonderfully. Thank you very much for giving us that version of Paul's debate with the Corinthians. Yeah, if Jesus is not risen from the dead, we are just lost. We're just wandering around. But the power of the resurrection isn't just to say that, well, we've got hope when we die. It's to say we have power while we live. We have power while we live to give ourselves away, to do the upside down things. I wasn't going to say this, but we have some theology going on in our society these days that is just absolutely wrong. Charity does not begin at home. And the gospel is not just about me and my family and my wife. And then after that's settled, I go and maybe I'll have a little bit left for you who might be a little bit further away from me. That's not what I'm reading in the words of Jesus and in the actions of Jesus. His Good Samaritan story was about dealing with those who you despise the most and finding in them the agents of love that we are meant to pattern ourselves after. We have a spiritual, theological debate that we need to be careful and cautious about how we articulate it, because it's all about how we then live. And it's related to this blessing and this woe business. And it's related to how the church, how God has really moved the church forward and used the church over time. It's related to our upside downness. So how did they do it? In a sense, Jeremiah just tells us exactly how. Because they did not trust in pure mortals. They gave their heart, they gave the center of their being to God. If it's all about us as humans and what we can do, if those are the centers of our lives, what we have and the power we possess and so on and so forth, then all of that will make us just like one of those bushes in the middle of the desert burning up. But Jeremiah says, if God is at the center of our hearts, and we listen and look at his love, God's love for us and for the world, then we are like a tree that will grow like one right next to the river, where the roots can go all the way out and dig themselves into the water. There was sufficient life for the church to turn the world upside down in its values, to say that the first shall be last and the last shall be first, to say that Jesus died for all people, to care for those who are the most marginalized of all of society, and lift them up as if they were princes and kings and queens, because their roots were in the very love of God that was pulsating through their being, through the gift of the Holy Spirit. And that is us. That is our opportunity. It'd be lovely if someday the St. Helena City Council, they got all flustered and they said, those people who are turning the world upside down have come among us Oh, thanks be to God.